Hey, good evening, everybody. I trust you're being let into the wonderful experience of Zoom once again. Welcome to Farm Table Foundation and our evening with Earl Duckett, photographer. We've also worked with Earl as a hunting guide and teacher here at Farm Table, so we're delighted to have Earl here. He'll probably talk about this, but his love of the outdoors and hunting and fishing is one of the things that led him really into photography and sharing that with other people. So Farm Table, my name is Mike Scott. I'm the program director here. We're delighted to have you here. Our mission is to build local food culture as well as to build community and support conservation. Those are a couple of things we try and do through our programming. And this kind of event certainly builds community and also, points to the beauty of the natural world, and certainly the farmers that we support through all the food we buy here is organic, and well over half of it is from very local farms who are farming in ways that protect soil and water. So indeed, protect the kind of natural beauty that Earl is so drawn to photographing. So thank you again for being here, everybody. Earl, feel free to say more about yourself and we'll get started. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you to Farm Table Foundation for making this opportunity to be available. They are an important part of the Amory community and support of the local artists. So my name is Earl Duckett. I am a photographer, I guess. I wouldn't call myself a professional because I don't do this for a living. It's really more of a hobby that's morphed into showing my work at art galleries, and given me the opportunity to get involved with our art community locally. I'm going to talk a little bit about photography. This is an hour program, so we're not going to have an in-depth instruction on photography. Photography is really, there are four basic premises. There's a lot more than that, but four basic ones. There's something called aperture. Aperture defines how big the hole is, the opening is in the lens that allows light to come through to some kind of a sensor. Could be film. In the old days, it was film. Now, with the advent of digital cameras, it is a sensor. And the size of that opening is called the aperture. If you're familiar with cameras, the f-stop is what defines the size of the opening. And f2 or 2.8 is a very large opening. f22 is a very small opening. And that's important because that in combination with shutter speed defines exposure. Well, there's more to it than that, but those are the two basic elements. Second one is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the length of the time that opening in the lens is open. If the opening is small, like f22, the shutter speed will be longer in order to properly expose the sensor or the film. At f2 or 2.8, the shutter speed will be much shorter because the opening is larger and it allows more light to expose the sensor or the film. The third element is called ISO. ISO, and if I knew what that stood for, I'd be really smart. But ISO defines the sensitivity of the sensor. If you can remember back to the film days, ISO 100 was not as sensitive as ISO 800. 800 film, more sensitive, took less light to expose it. So if you're photographing a running animal, you want a higher ISO in order to reduce the shutter speed so that the animal doesn't go, is sharp, basically. And then the fourth concept is composition. And composition has very little to do with the camera, although there are some elements of composition, depth of field, that have to do with how you set aperture and shutter speed. The composition, there's a lot to it. It's what makes a photograph more appealing, depending on how you compose. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through these images. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to pick up the camera and I'm going to pick up the camera. I'm going to pick up the computer and hold it up against the photograph. It's not the most ideal situation, but it'll work. So this first photograph here that I want to talk about, this is called, what is it called? Green darner, black and white. So this is a green darner dragonfly. It's taken early in the morning. So there's dew on the wings. And if you look at this, you see that the background is blurred. The dragonfly is sharp, but the background is blurred. Now the way you get that is to shoot, set your camera up, open the aperture. So you're shooting through a large opening, and then and you reduce the shutter speed. So the sensor doesn't have time to get all the details in the background. That's called depth of field. Depth of field is the portion of your photograph that's in focus. So depth of field is a really important concept. So talk a little bit about how you get this kind of an image. You go out when it's kind of cool, even cold. The dragonflies, when it's cold out, are pretty lethargic. They don't fly away. You can walk right up to them. You can actually, this one actually had a blade of grass coming that he had one of his legs on, and I didn't like that in my composition, so I pulled that out, and I pulled on it and it started to move, and he picked his leg up and I was able to move it away. When they've got this much dew on them, it's hard for them to fly. So they don't move. They don't want to move, and they're cold. So I worked around this dragonfly. I probably took 25 or 30 pictures. I probably worked around it a half hour, and he never moved, other than to lift his leg. So that's a example of depth of field, and it's an example of using the settings in the camera creatively to give you the kind of image that you're looking for. So that's that photograph. Now I'm going to just walk down here and show a couple other photographs. This one is called Eagle's Repast. And Eagle's Repast is a photograph of an eagle. And if you look closely at the branch, you see the fishtail. He's got a shad. Hopefully you can see that. He's got a shad that he picked up that was floating on the surface of the water. This was taken in the spring of the year, and it was taken on the Mississippi. spring of the year, eagles congregate and they stay in one place as the food is available. And shad, when the backwaters are frozen over, shad die during the wintertime. And when the ice starts to melt, the eagles congregate. And I can remember when I was photographing that day, you could sit in one place and there were 150 eagles, 150, 160, somewhere in there that you could see in the trees around you. This was closer than the rest of them, but one of the things you want to do if you're photographing wildlife is try to figure out where the wildlife are going to be, and food source is one of the key elements. All wildlife have to eat, and if there's food available, they'll be there. So that's that image. The next image is a image of a great gray owl. And the great gray owl, back, and I can't remember for sure what year it was, but I think it was 98 or 99, somewhere in there. There was what they call an eruption. And an eruption of great gray owls happened because there was the moles and the rodents in northern Canada died off, and the great gray owls had to come south into Wisconsin in order to find food. And I was up north and looking for great gray owls because I knew this eruption was going on. And I saw a great gray owl up in a tree. So I was in my truck. I stopped, I got out, I got my camera out, got all set up. And I'm watching this great gray owl, and he's looking down at the ground. He's looking like that. And I looked down at my camera because I was going to change the setting. And I looked up and he's gone. And I don't know if you've ever been close to an owl when he's in flight, but they're very quiet. And I heard some rustling in the leaves. Now he's across the road from me. I heard some rustling in the leaves, and he comes waddling out of the leaves. You know, birds only have 2 feet, or they don't have. He looked like he was waddling. Okay, so he came out of the woods, and he had this mouse hanging from his beak. And he looked at me, and I'm probably how wide is the road, 16, 20 feet away. And he looked at me and he threw his head back and he swallowed that mouse whole. And of course, I was trying to take pictures of him at that time. But sometimes with wild animals, they don't stay still long enough for you to get a good shot. So I have some very blurry shots of a great gray owl with a mouse. But I don't show those. So, and if you look closely, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but if you look closely, look at his beak. His beak has got blood on it. And that's from that mouse. And he sat there and he looked at me for a few seconds, maybe 10 seconds. And then he flew right at me and he came right over my head. He landed in the tree behind me, and then he stood there and turned and looked back at me, and that's when I got that shot. He spun around and I managed to get him in focus. Wildlife photographer.
That's a great story, Earl. Just a couple questions came in too, if you don't mind.
Okay.
One, Tom wanted to know, what are your prints printed on?
Okay, these are printed on aluminum. I have found that they do a great job of showcasing nature photography. And so I went to aluminum about 3 years ago, 2 years ago. It's somewhat expensive, but they really make the photographs pop. Hope that
And then-
answers.
Yeah, and then William says, what's your favorite lens length?
Well, that depends on what I'm shooting. Probably if I had to pick a favorite, it's 180 is it millimeters? 600, 180 macro lens. That's what this was taken with, was Dragonfly. Macro lenses are designed to focus close up. And so if you want to do flower photography, butterflies, dragonflies, that kind of stuff, mushrooms, just a great lens. And it really, you get a big image. So when you blow it up, it's big. They have 100 millimeter, I'm not even sure that's right, millimeter, but they have 100 macro, where if I used 100 on this one, the Dragonfly would be smaller in the frame. So, but I've got 20 some lenses. If I'm photographing eagles, like this one, a 500 or a 600 millimeter. Photographing birds, 500 or 600. Just depends on what you're using. If I'm photographing landscapes, I'm probably photographing with a wide angle, which might be a 12 millimeter or a 20 millimeter, depending on what I happen to have on the camera. I've got both of them. So I'm going to talk about this image. This is an image of a little Ripple Falls area in a river in Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And that, you see how blue that is? The reason that's blue is I took that image on a clear day after the sun went down. So there's a lot of blue light reflecting off the sky. And it creates a blue tinge to the image. And I didn't know that when I took the image. And I couldn't see it. But when I developed it, that was taken on slide film. When I developed it, that's how it came out. And then I did some research and I figured out why. And that's just something you can use if you want to get that kind of an image. Okay, so then we're going to go to this one. This is an image. This is an image on the shores of Lake Superior up in Canada. And I did the circle tour. For those of you who want to know what the circle tour is, you can drive around Lake Superior. It's about, if I remember right, it's about 3,000 miles. Takes a couple of days, or it could take 2 weeks if you wanted to do it that way. I took a couple of days. I was by myself. And I stopped on the northern shore of Lake Superior to camp for the night. And there was this little rock island out in the it's a peninsula out into the lake. And I walked out there, and there was an island out there that I want to take a photograph of, but it wasn't the right time of day, and it was in the wrong direction. So I couldn't get a good image of that, but I turned around and I saw this light reflecting off of these rocks, and that became the image. And what you find out when you're photographing nature is there's always something take a photograph of. When I'm going to switch pedestals here. Give you a little history. When I started doing this, or before I decided to do it, I was out hunting wild turkeys. And what interested me in that moment was I had 5 wild turkeys coming up, and they were all lined up. Head, another head, they were all lined up. If I would have taken my gun and shot, I would have probably got them all. But I just sat there and watched, and the sun was coming up over my shoulder, and beautiful reds and blues of their heads, red, white, blue of their heads. And I thought, wow, this is, I can't describe to people what I'm seeing. It's hard for people to see, to understand. And I said, you know, I should take a picture of this. I didn't know anything about photography. And so that prompted me to go and I bought a camera, relatively inexpensive camera and an inexpensive lens, thinking I could go out and take some really good pictures without any training at all. And I found out that's generally not true. I was very disappointed with the images that I took. Am I doing wrong? So then I educated myself. I went out and I bought, back then it was John Shaw. He was a famous wildlife photographer, John Gerlach, Rod Plank. Took some seminars, read some books, and really studied and figured out what I needed for equipment to do what I wanted to do. Learned the basics, and then came back and started taking pictures. And that process took me about 2 years. But it was well worth it, because I would not have been able to do this without that educational process that I went through. I went out to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, spring of the year, and I got this image. I don't know if you can see that. I'm not doing that right there. This is like looking in a mirror if you turn it the wrong way. This is a mother buffalo and a baby. And this, I drove along the road and I saw these buffalo in a field. So I stopped, and this baby was running. There was a little ravines there, and it was running all over, bouncing around. Actually, you know, like a little calf or a little horse or something, really just celebrating life. And so I got out of the truck and got my camera out, and I heard that mother buffalo, I guess that's a cow buffalo, grunt. And when she grunted, that calf ran right in beside her. And I just pulled up and took the shot, and they were walking across in front of me. And I got the one shot where the calf was a little ahead of the mother, and then the mother was behind the mother, and the mother protected it and walked it off. And it was really interesting to watch that. But with nature photography, you have to be ready all the time, because you never know what you're going to see. I remember one time, not very far from Osceola, I was out driving around, coming home from work, and I always took the back roads coming home. And I came down the road and met right next to this lake. And I'm driving around, and I looked over, and here's a bald eagle diving into the lake, maybe 20 feet from the road, grabbed the smallmouth bass and lifted up and and took off. And I had my camera right next to me. I never even got it up. I mean, it just happens so fast. So you have to be ready all the time, but sometimes you have to drive and you don't want to mix those two up.
Hey, Earl,
Yeah,
just a time check. It's about 7:30, just in terms of numbers of images you want to focus on in the other room too. But then I also have a question for you.
okay, go ahead.
What is an instance when you would not need to open the aperture and focus on the subject?
Where you, um, landscape photography would be a good one. Let me show you this one. This is one where you didn't shoot wide open. And the reason you don't shoot wide open in that image, I'm sorry about the light reflection on there. The reason you don't shoot wide open on that image is because everything is static. Nothing's moving. There's a little ripple in the water, but not significant in it. And if that isn't sharp, it doesn't take away from the photograph. So that's one where I would close down and maybe I'd shoot that at f/16. Much smaller image. Now, what that does is it allows the sensor to sense all of the detail in the picture. And so that it's sharp when you process it. So if you're shooting landscapes or you're shooting something that's not moving, and you want that detail, then you want to close down your lens, shoot at f/16 or f/22, depending on the lens. So that would be an example. This is an example of shooting and you want the black background blurred. Not only do you want the background blurred, but you want the eagle to be sharp. And so I'm shooting wide open. That's what we call shooting wide open.
And Earl.
Yeah.
Earl, that was a question from Matt, and I think he has an inside joke here. He says, "Tell Earl, go Bears."
Yeah, I have my Packer, I have my Packer mask, and Matt's very observant.
All right. Anyway, go ahead, Earl.
Okay, so I think we'll go to the next room. And here's a picture of a monarch butterfly. Give you a little history on that picture. I sat in my truck. I had the lens mounted on the window, and I was trying to catch that monarch in flight. And I did, but monarchs aren't that pretty in flight. They're much better when they pose like that. So I never used any of those images, but he did land on that, I think that's rough prairie star. Okay, I'm gonna go into the next room. If I can get out. Okay, I'll start over here. A little bit about bird photography. I'm just going to first walk through these. There's a chickadee. And unfortunately, those are not snowflakes. Those are reflections of lights. There's a meadowlark, western meadowlark. There's a red-bellied woodpecker. And a male and a female cardinal. There's a female. Bird photography is kind of a, especially songbirds. Whoops, I lost my images. Hold on.
We see you fine, Earl.
Well, that's good.
but I'll come
Here,
out.
no, I'm back. I'm
Okay,
back.
great.
I'm back. Bird photography is what you find out, let's say your cameras come with like a 50mm lens or an 80mm lens. And if you take a picture of a bird, it's amazing how small that bird is in that picture. It's like this big. And so to do good bird photography, it's good to have at least a 300mm lens. These were taken with a 500mm lens. 500mm lens weighs about 16 pounds. So you got to have it on a tripod. But it's not that you can't take pictures of birds with a 50mm lens, but if you want to show personality, if you want them to be bigger in your frame, you've got to use, it's better to use the kind of equipment that gets you there. So that's one thing about bird photography. And these are all shot pretty much wide open, which means we have a shallow depth of field. The background here is blurred, which makes for a nice photograph. This image here is the bird is sitting in a bunch of weeds, so those are in focus. It doesn't hurt the image, but it's not that. We'll see one later that's of that same meadowlark that uses the concept of a shallow depth of field, and you'll see the difference. I'm going to go over here and talk about some other images. Here we have prairie smoke. Prairie smoke, this is a trillium with a moth. Trillium with a moth. Prairie smoke. And one of my favorite images, a Dewey Dragonfly. Dewey Dragonfly was taken in a swamp before the sun came up. It's starting to get light in the background, and you can see how they kind of shine. You can get down low and look towards where it's starting to get light, and these dragonflies look like little diamonds out there, little jewels, because the light is coming through those wings, and you can pick them out. And it's amazing. In a swamp, if there's been a dragonfly hatch, there's hundreds of these in there. And you find one that has a pretty good composition, which is what I did here. And these had kind of a reddish leaf. This was in the fall of the year. And so I put just a real light magenta filter on it to give it a little color. That's how I created that image. Okay, moving along. See if I don't have a clock in here. Okay.
It's
This
about
is a
7:36.
736, okay. Trying to not go over too much. This is an image of rocks on the shore of Lake Superior. And I took that image in a class, a photography class, and there were 12 or 13 photographers. I don't remember exactly, but somebody said, let's go pick up some rocks and then we'll take pictures of it. Okay. And it worked. I mean, we went and picked up all the pretty rocks that were around, put them in a big pile, flattened it out, poured water on it, and then we took turns taking pictures of it. And so you can create some interesting nature photography. It's a little forethought and creativity. So this image here is a picture of a Timberwolf. And he was really close. Now this, if you look at this wolf and you look at his eye, see this one pretty good. If you've seen wolves in the wild, they're very wary. And there's just a sense about them. I've been on the deer stand and had wolves walk in on me, and they're very stealthy, and if their sense is something is not right, they'll actually back up and walk. And with these two wolves that I saw did just that. They sensed something was wrong, and they just backed up and left. But they weren't as tame looking as this wolf. And this wolf happened to be in a place where you could pay money to go and shoot captive animals. He's a captive wolf. But they keep them in this 30-acre fenced area. They release them into that fenced area when they have photographers around. And this wolf would run around in there. I have a picture of that wolf licking my friend's lens. She's looking through the camera and he's licking the lens, and you go, he's not really a wild wolf, but he's a wolf. So sometimes you have the opportunity to take pictures of something other than wild animals. Here's a couple of images of the river. See if I can get this. Right there's a picture. I was on the St. Croix River and photographing fall color. I don't know if that shows up very well, but and it was so foggy I couldn't see the other side of the lake or of the river. And then the fog started to lift. I was also trying to shoot that morning a leaf falling from a tree just as it hit the water. So I probably took 1,000 shots that morning. And in a few minutes, we'll see that leaf. It's called fallen. And it's kind of an interesting image. This one is flooded timber on the Mississippi. It's a different look. This one is a black and white daisies and trees. I was driving down the road and there was a series of trees in or some woods that had been recently cleared out, and the daisies were just nuts in there. So I stopped and trespassed. Nobody cared, but I trespassed a little bit and I got a shot. It was right on the road. There was no houses around. I didn't ask permission first. This is an example of an image. This is a mushroom. And it grows on the side of a stump. I took this up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And the reason I want to show that image is because I'm going to get the pedestal. Okay, sorry about that. Composing, sometimes you compose in camera. Put your camera up and you start moving around and you're looking at your subject, and it makes a difference the angle that you're shooting that subject from. And I had a 180 macro on and I went in real close and I'm moving around and looking for something that looks interesting. And then I found it, and then I put the camera on the tripod and took it from that angle. But that's another technique. Most of the time, the best composition is not on a tripod at eye level. A lot of times, the best composition is laying on your stomach as low as you can get and focusing on your subject. So one of the techniques that you use is this: put your camera up to your eye and move around and find the image that's most interesting. And there's a couple other, this one down here.
Earl, by the way, we got another question here.
All right.
And I'll interject. Tom asks, do you do much processing of your images via software like Photoshop? If so, do you spend much time doing that?
I hate doing that. That is a part of wildlife photography or nature photography that I don't like, is the post-processing, but you have to do that. I used to use Photoshop. Photoshop as a software program is capable of doing just about anything you want to an image. It is not my favorite because I don't understand 90% of what it does. I know how to do the basics. Lightroom, I find, is much easier. It does the same things a little differently, but you can adjust temperature. You can make your images pop. I don't do a lot of that. I try to print them as they are in the camera. But the fact is, sometimes they're better if you can do the post-processing. And there's some post-processing on every image. I don't know if that answered the question, but I use Lightroom. Okay, this image I was talking about composing in camera. That's how I took this image. The daisies, there were a ton of them out there, were somewhat old. They had some spots on them, most of them. And I kept walking around and looking until I saw the image I was looking for and then took the picture. So,
Earl, before you took the picture though, did you know you were looking for that kind of composition? It's a really interesting composition.
no. I found that in the camera. I was moving the camera around, trying to find the composition. Gotcha. And all of a sudden there it was. And you know, it's like, you know it when you see it. If prior to taking that image, somebody would ask me, what were you looking for? I would have said something. But once I saw it, then I took the time to set up and take the image. Set up on a tripod, go through the process that gives you a fairly decent photograph. So that's an example of one that happened. This is an example of a shallow depth of field. This is a deer that's standing in a bunch of brush. And I took this image with a 600mm lens, and I almost threw it away because it didn't have the whole deer. And then I kept going back to it, looking at it, and I'm going, you know, that's pretty interesting. He's standing in the brush. You can see depth of field is very shallow here. There's a little bit of fur that's in focus. This is kind of blurred back here. the nose and the eyes are in focus. And in animals, the most important thing to be in focus is the eyes. If the eyes are soft, it's, it's an image, but it's probably not one that you're going to show. So this is called camo doe because she's standing there. And if you didn't know she was there, you walk right by her. Now, a human eye can see that deer pretty clearly because all of this stuff isn't soft. But the camera, because you're shooting wide open, shallow depth of field, it gives you this interesting view. Here's another image of a dragonfly called Dragonfly in Blue. Did the same thing. I got down and looked towards the light sky to find the dragonfly. And then I put a bunch of spruce trees in the background. They're not real close. So my shallow depth of field caught that image against that dark blue background. Let's see, do I have anything else here? Okay, so here's another set of images. Remember we were talking about a meadowlark? That's that same meadowlark, but he flew and he landed on this bush, taken in the spring of the year.
Earl, could you adjust the camera there? There, that's good.
I'm sorry. It's hard to, yeah, you can see he's in focus, but the background is completely blurred. He just pops. I guess I can't. Yeah. When I talked about trying to shoot a leaf falling, this is what came out, minus the highlights of the reflection there. I got the leaf just as it hit the water. And from a composition standpoint, that composition is somewhere around, there's a rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds in composition speak is you want the focal point of the picture to be there, 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 there. A third of the way in, a third of the way down, a third of the way up, a third of the way in, so forth. And so this is kind of the rule of thirds. It makes for an interesting composition. If this bird would have been over here, that would not have been a particularly good composition because as a viewer of the photograph, he's looking that way and it leaves you wondering what he's looking at. He's got nowhere to go. If you catch him flying and you catch a bird flying and he's going that way, you want him over on this side of the photograph. Just something that it just makes for a more interesting photograph. I'm going to over here. We have a phone charger plugged into the wall. This is an image of wild mustangs that have been captured and are waiting for homes. But there was probably 150 mustangs in this area. And these three horses came, there's a whole bunch of mustangs over in here. These three just came, they were playing and they just came running around the herd, and I was able to capture them by themselves. So it's a compelling image. A lot of movement in that image. Show it to you again. A lot of movement, a lot of motion. It's always good to have motion. If you can capture motion and keep it sharp, it's good to have motion in your photograph. Sometimes you want to capture motion and and blur it. That's entirely up to the photographer. How are we doing for time, Mike?
We're at 7:52, Earl, and we do have one other question that came in.
Okay, go ahead.
Ryan asks about tips for beginners with wildlife photography. What would you work on or perfect first?
Well, the first thing I do is I'd say find a couple of books that that talk about wildlife photography specifically, and use those books to educate yourself. That's the very first thing. And I would do that before I bought equipment. It's just a smart thing to do. The second thing, once you have that and you get your equipment, the second thing I would do is I would say, don't focus on wildlife photography, focus on nature photography. And the reason I say that is wildlife can be really boring to try to photograph. You can set in a blind. I've done this, set in a blind for 8 hours and not see a live animal. It happens. And you get pretty disenchanted with it. If you can't shoot. So I would focus on nature photography. I would focus on looking, spend most of your time looking. Focus on early in the day or late in the day. Usually early in the day is better, just because everything's, most of the time, is covered with dew, and that's always a good thing to focus on. It really makes the images pop, and the light is soft, and there's a lot of color to the light, usually towards golds and oranges. That's also true in the evening. In the evening, it's, if you get someplace where you can do silhouettes. Like one time I was on a lake, I was going to photograph the sunset, and it was really quite beautiful, but the best photograph was the fisherman that slowly went across the lake in front of me, and I got a silhouette of that fisherman against that light sky with a lot of color. So, and that just reminds me that just because the sun went down doesn't mean you're done. Many times the best color from a photographic standpoint comes a half hour after the sun goes down. So just hang in there. I mean, if it's cloudy, it's not going to work. But if there's clouds and they're lit up by the sun, a lot of times those colors get really deep 20 minutes to a half hour after the sun goes down. Okay, so I was talking about this image is an image of a dragonfly. I guess I showed that already, but you can see he's got dewy wings. But this was taken in a field of, I've forgotten what it's called, but there's a grass that turns kind of almost a shade of red or pink. And that's what this orange is back in here, is that grass. So a couple other images, flowers. Again, this is you see that shallow depth of field. The blue flag iris is silhouetted and kind of pops. Same thing on this geranium, wild geranium. And here's an image of a couple of bluebirds. If if you look at that image, right there, image, look at those blueberries, and they look like bluebirds. I was at an art show, selling art, and I had a Native American come in. He walks up to that image and he looks at it, and he said, "Look, you have a picture of two bluebirds." And I walked over and I looked at that and I said, "I'll be damned, I do." I mean, he saw something different in that image than I saw. So that's one of the nice things about nature photography. You can look at it 2 different times or 3 different times or 4 different times, and you see something entirely different. So how are we doing for time, Mike? I've got a few minutes left.
Yeah, a few minutes.
Okay, I'll show you one more here. This is a fall. There we go. This is a fall color picture. Straight Lake State Park, which is just north of here. Fog coming off the water early in the morning. So the nice thing about nature photography is there's always something to shoot. You can go out in your backyard and shoot bugs, flowers, always something. Okay, do we have any more questions?
I don't see any now, but feel free to type them in, folks, or if you want to unmute yourself, it can be kind of nice to hear a voice. If you feel like doing that, you could unmute yourself and ask a question. I did want to just say that, I think one of the things that photographers can help us do is to see the world in new ways. Like that one right behind, I had to ask you what that was. That's a mushroom right behind you there, right, Earl?
That's right. That's
yeah.
Right.
And, in some ways, Farm Table is about helping us see food in new ways, if you will. Food is one of the main ways we interact with the world, and what we eat, as Wendell Berry says, determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. And we try and help people see that. And the kind of world we create and the beauty we see or don't see does relate to the kind of food we eat and the kind of community farms that we support and so on. So it's one of the reasons, one of the connections I see with photography and seeing the world in new ways. And Earl, I really appreciate you sharing some of the ways you see the world through your photography. And folks, I did mention that, obviously like the mushroom, you can see the chandelier in the mushroom. If you come in here on your, you'll see the photos even better. And we are open our restaurant hours, during our restaurant hours, for distance dining, but then you could just also come in and see the photos if you like in person, which are for sale. So you can also support Earl that way.
Yeah, and just for those of you who are out of town, Farm Table Foundation is in Amory, Wisconsin. So I'm not sure we mentioned that before.
That's a good point, Earl. Oh yeah, we are in Amory, Wisconsin, about an hour and a quarter from downtown Minneapolis.
Yep.
And Earl, we're getting some thanks, folks saying great tips and wonderful photos. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Earl.
Yep, you're welcome.
That's your brother.
Oh. Wow.
Thanks, Earl.
You're welcome. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Earl. This is your sister.
Yeah. To do a Zoom meeting sometime.
Family supported.
That's right. Very good.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, Earl. So just thank you all for your attention tonight and your interest and your support of Earl and Farm Table. And Earl, thank you again. The photos will be up for at least another 6 weeks, I believe.
Yep.
As Earl has another show at Art Z Gallery here in Amory as well. So good night, everybody, and thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Right.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye, night.
Take care, folks.